Ever wonder what it feels like to literally pull a monster out of solid rock? Marcelo Isasi described the moment he finally saw the skull of an ancient land croc appear from a nodule as a marvelous, incredible, and unforgettable moment. Imagine chiseling for weeks, with the COVID pandemic isolating you in the middle of nowhere, only to realize the fossil you just uncovered belongs to a predator nobody's ever seen before. A croc that didn't wait by the water. It actively hunted dinosaurs on land. Picture spending your days crossing a stretch of land so dry and windswept that even the shrubs seem half defeated by the weather. Now imagine doing that while the rest of the world is locked indoors, teaching classes over video calls and stockpiling bags of rice. Sounds a lot better, actually. That was the situation in 2020, when a small, lucky paleontology team led by Fernando Novas and Marcelo Isasi hiked the outcrops of the Maastrichtian-aged Chorrillo Formation in southern Patagonia. COVID guidelines had sealed international borders, universities were shuttered, and travel was cut down to the bare minimum. Yet, these researchers were out there walking gullies and ridges looking for bones that could be millions of years older than human civilization itself. They did not know it yet, but this trip would produce something that didn't look like any croc we're used to seeing basking on a riverbank today. For the first several days, though, the hunt was far less glamorous than the headlines you eventually read in scientific journals. Imagine climbing up eroded ridges, brushing rock dust from your eyes with sandpaper dry gloves, and bending down over and over to pick at small scraps. Most of what turned up in those early passes were bone fragments that were too weathered to identify, or limestone nodules that looked no different from the thousands scattered all across the surface. A nodule, by the way, is simply a compact lump of mineral that can form around a nucleus, sometimes fossils like a natural time capsule. They're heavier than the surrounding matrix, often spheroid in shape, and maddeningly unpredictable. Most turn out to be nothing at all, while a rare few can be jackpot finds. The tension for the scientists came from knowing they had to check as many as possible, but also realizing that each one was basically a gamble. And under strict distancing protocols, they lacked the usual big crew of hands to share the load. The isolation added its own weight too. Normally, prospecting in Patagonia comes with shared dinners and tents, conversations with locals, lots of beer, and a sense of being part of something bigger. In 2020, you were more likely to eat alone, clean your tools with sanitizer, keep distance even from your own colleagues, and sleep knowing that your backup, medical or otherwise, was pretty much running at the thinnest line possible. That silence makes you think. It makes you wonder, could one of those dull gray rocks hide the outline of a predator's skull, or are you just hoarding dead weight in your pack? Then came the breakthrough. One of the nodules cracked open under a hammer blow, and inside was the unmistakable gleam of enamel. Teeth, sharp and still embedded in bone, stared back. That alone was enough to spike energy in the group. Crocodiliform teeth stand out from many other reptiles because they're robust and frequently only slightly recurved, sometimes even finely serrated. To see them preserved so neatly was proof the layers around the chorrillo still had stories to tell. It transformed the energy of the hunt, from trudging in uncertainty to scanning every outcrop with the constant thought that something important could be underfoot. And then they found the nodule that would change the project entirely. It wasn't a handheld lump, but a massive block of cemented rock with telltale ridges suggesting it enclosed something bigger. Breaking it open carefully revealed contours not of loose teeth, but of cranial bone. Marcelo Isasi himself called it a marvelous, incredible, unforgettable moment. You can place yourself there and imagine what it felt like to see the rough form of a skull, jaw curve and all, materializing beneath your own hammer. The relief wasn't just that they had found something worth carrying, it was that after days of small finds and heavy uncertainty, the gamble had paid off at odds nobody could have calculated. By this point, it was evident that they were working with something unusually complete. Not just a scattering of teeth or an isolated jaw tip, but a skull that stretched close to half a meter in preserved length. That made it one of the better crocodiliform skulls collected from Patagonia, locked firmly inside a rock so heavy that moving it would be a logistical mission of its own. The fieldwork had gone from scratching around for scraps to suddenly safeguarding a specimen that might hold the key to understanding an entire branch of predatory crocs. But there was still a big problem. Fossils that size don't simply hitch a ride in someone's backpack. Getting a 20-inch skull block out of this desert meant strapping it, lifting it, and eventually hauling it miles away until a truck could bear it north. That's when the story shifted. The thrill of discovery gave way to the next question facing the team. How do you move a skull locked in stone out of no man's land and get it ready for actual study? Imagine hauling a block of stone so heavy it needed its own transport plan, strapped down and carried more than 1,500 miles before anyone even knew what it really held. What looked in the field like a promising mass of rock with hints of bone inside became a logistical headache once it was confirmed to be too large for backpacks or makeshift sleds. The team had to organize a truck capable of navigating rough Patagonian roads before heading across most of Argentina all the way to the city of Buenos Aires. Even then, nobody could say with certainty whether the fossil was complete or fractured, because the bulk of it was still wrapped in a hard shell of stone. Every bump in the road, every vibration from the engine carried the risk of damaging something that was irreplaceable. Fossilized bone is not nearly as tough as it looks in photos. It is often brittle, porous, and ready to split if stressed in just the wrong direction. By the time the nodules reached the lab, the real work was to begin. Closing the doors on a preparation room and facing a lump of sandstone the size of a small cooler may not sound dramatic compared to the field discovery, but it's the stage where you either ruin or reveal years of evolutionary history. Paleontological preparation uses an arsenal of specialized tools, some of which look like the dental instruments you see in movies. Technicians rely on pneumatic hammers. Think miniature jackhammers powered by compressed air that can chip away dense rock without too much pressure. For more resistant stone or precise cuts, diamond-tipped discs provide the strength, while vibration-free work calls for dental-sized picks, some as fine as a sewing needle. These tiny tools allow preparators to move grain by grain, uncovering edges of bone while still leaving support from the surrounding material. That surrounding rock is what paleontologists call the matrix. It's basically the rocky background holding the fossil in place. The matrix can act as both a protective barrier and a prison. Too much of it makes the fossil invisible, yet removing it carelessly can collapse fragile edges. In many cases, the fossil itself has chemically bonded with the surrounding sediment, so when you remove one, you risk weakening the other. This is when patience levels separate amateurs from professionals. It may take an afternoon to expose a single tooth, or weeks before distinguishing the boundary of a skull bone from the matrix it's embedded in. Because of those challenges, researchers also lean on imaging technology. CT scans, computerized tomography, work by bypassing X-rays through the block to generate detailed cross-sections. Stacked together, they produce a three-dimensional model of what lies inside the rock without having to split it open. In the case of this croc specimen, those scans provided early confirmation that a broad snout and intact brain case were hiding inside the nodules. This gave workers a preview map, letting them target the right areas with physical preparation tools rather than gambling blindly. Being able to see tooth rows and cranial cavities before exposure is invaluable, especially when the actual fossilized bone might be thinner than a pencil lead. Even when bone does emerge from the matrix, it doesn't mean it's stable. Fossil bone often flakes under the lightest touch, producing slivers that separate from the main piece. To prevent this, technicians use cyanoacrylate glue, the same chemical family you might know as superglue. Applied in very small, watery drops, it soaks into the porous bone and creates a reinforcing shell that locks fragments back together. Step by step, tooth crowns, jaw seams, and delicate ridges can be solidified before moving forward. Sometimes a block must be left alone for days just to let stabilizer dry before more tools come out. It's slow, it's repetitive, and it demands a tolerance for monotony. But it's the reason the final fossil survives long enough to teach scientists something real. Month after month, technicians repeated those cycles. Hammer back more of the matrix, pause for glue, scan problem areas, then take up the needle pick again. Progress can feel glacial, but gradually anatomical outlines started to sharpen. The broad snout, distinctive in its proportions, cleared enough to measure. Zigzag surface texture showed the characteristic ornamentation of croc skulls. Sutures between bones, once invisible beneath layers of rock, became readable like the seams on a puzzle piece. Bit by bit, the sterile block of stone transformed into something recognizably animal. When the final dust was wiped and the stabilizers dried, almost all of the original 20-inch skull sat there in relief. What had been a sealed package hiding its contents since the Cretaceous was now ready for a huge group of Argentinian, Brazilian, Portuguese, and Japanese scientists to study, describe, and eventually name Costensuchus atrox, croc of the harsh Patagonian wind, in an August 2025 paper in PLOS ONE. With the skull now unwrapped and its features visible, the next challenge was clear: figuring out exactly what type of creature this fossil represented. What type of croc grows knife blade teeth and a jaw built more like a mammal's killing tool than the gape of a swamp dweller? That's exactly what Costensuchus brings to the table. When the skull finally emerged from the rock, scientists measured it at about 49 centimeters, which is just under 20 inches. Almost half that length belonged to the snout alone. But here's the strange part: the snout wasn't narrow and tubular like you'd expect from a modern fish snapper. Instead, it was broad, heavy, and almost squared off, which immediately raised new questions about how this animal actually made a living. You don't adapt a head like that if your main goal is to nab slippery prey from a river. A head that wide suggests another style of feeding entirely. The real shock came once they looked closely at the teeth. These weren't the rounded conical pegs that modern crocs rely on to crush and hold. They were what paleontologists call zyphodont teeth. That term simply refers to teeth that are compressed from side to side, blade-shaped, and serrated along both edges. Each tooth edge was adapted to slice through flesh rather than puncture it. If you've ever looked at the serrated edge of a kitchen knife and noticed how it tears into tough material, you've got a basic idea of what these teeth were doing inside living prey. That kind of dental weaponry is rare in crocs today, but it does appear in some of their extinct relatives. And when it does, it usually means you're looking at a hunter built for cutting meat off bone, rather than swallowing fish whole. Add to that one very important feature: the fourth dentary tooth, which emerges from the lower jaw. In Costensuchus, this tooth was oversized and fit neatly into a slot in the upper jaw so the mouth could close without obstruction. That plug-in system isn't just a neat quirk, it acts like a locking mechanism. When this croc clamped down, that single enlarged tooth acted almost like a bolt, reinforcing the hold. Imagine a bear trap closing, with that one anchoring spike making it nearly impossible for the prey to wrench itself free. The whole jaw showed evidence of reinforcement around this area, which suggests it would withstand the stress of struggling victims. The shape of the skull also hinted at something else: unbelievable bite force. Behind the eyes, the skull had room for what are called adductor chambers. These are basically recesses where the big muscles that close the jaw attach. In Costensuchus, these chambers were both deep and wide, providing a massive attachment site for muscles. Larger muscle means stronger force, and in this case, we're talking about enough power to crush through bone or shear flesh in a single strike. Modern crocs also have impressive bite strength, but the difference is in how it's used. Modern crocs use it in ambush, clamping down and drowning prey in water. With Costensuchus, the combination of jaw architecture, serrated teeth, and those anchoring dentary spikes points to repeated slicing and tearing. Hunting prey actively on land where drowning wasn't an option. Even stranger, the surface of its skull bones was heavily ornamented. That phrase in paleontology means they carried deep pits, grooves, and ridges, far more than many related crocodiliforms. Ornamentation isn't just decoration, it can indicate reinforcement of the bone, attachment sites for skin tissues, or placement of sensory nodes. In the case of Costensuchus, the heavy ornamentation might have made the skull better at resisting torsion, twisting forces that come from thrashing captured prey. When you combine that with the reinforced lower jaw and blade-like teeth, you've got an animal specialized for holding and tearing in a way quite different from the mud-colored crocodiles hiding in rivers today. All of these traits paint a picture of a hypercarnivore, Its skull was too blunt for efficient fish catching, its teeth too sharp for anything but meat, and its muscles too oversized to be wasted on small invertebrates. It was adapted to hunt animals closer to its own size. In Patagonia, at the end of the Cretaceous, that meant mid-sized dinosaurs, smaller herbivores like Isasacursor, and even the young of giant titanosaurs would have been in constant danger if one of these croc predators was shadowing them across the floodplains. The arsenal here wasn't subtle. Wide snout, zyphodont serrations, anchoring lower teeth, massive jaw muscles, reinforced bone textures, all of them are marks of active predation on land. In short, this was not the sit-and-wait croc. This was something that ran, bit, and sliced its way into the role of a major terrestrial predator. And as strange as its skull looked, that was only half the story. The bones of the shoulders, forelimbs, and torso gave a surprisingly different picture than what you'd expect if you only knew crocodiles as squat, waterbound predators that belly crawl into ambushes. These new details suggested that Kostensuchus didn't behave like that at all. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a predator more at home running across floodplains than wallowing on a riverbank. The humerus, or upper arm bone, was immediately unusual. Unlike living crocs, Kostensuchus had a long, well-developed deltopectoral crest. If that sounds like jargon, think of the crest as an extended ridge of bone. That's the surface where large muscles of the shoulder and chest anchored. Muscles that would stabilize the arms and power strong forward movements. When you see a ridge like that, you can infer heavy musculature. Modern crocs don't need it because they rely on short bursts from the water, pulling themselves forward in sprawling gaits. Kostensuchus, on the other hand, looks like it needed strength at the shoulder for carrying weight in an upright stance. The torso reinforced this vision of a land predator. The shoulder girdle, the arrangement of bones that connect the arms to the body, was broad, giving a stable platform to resist impact as the limbs struck the ground. The pelvic girdle, which anchors the hind limbs, was also stout. Each element told the same story. This animal had a frame designed to bear weight effectively across land, not to sprawl flat across mud. If you imagine a predator lunging forward, bearing down on resisting prey, you need a skeleton that isn't going to collapse sideways under load. The preserved bones suggested exactly that sort of sturdiness. There is a catch though. The hind limbs themselves were missing from the fossil. That means paleontologists couldn't say with total certainty whether it walked in a fully erect posture, like a mammal, or leaned back toward a semi-sprawling gait more in line with some ancestral crocodiliforms. But comparisons can still be drawn. Other terrestrial croc relatives, such as the baurusúcids from Brazil, developed more upright stances. These animals carried their legs beneath the body, which gave them an advantage in speed and maneuverability. With Kostensuchus showing similar adaptations in its arms and torso, it's reasonable to propose it shared a version of that stance. Another piece of the puzzle came from the armor, or osteoderms. These are the bony plates that sit in the skin of many crocodile relatives. In living species, they create the knobby ridges you see across their backs. Osteoderms in Kostensuchus were present, providing the traditional shield against injury, but crucially they weren't so thick or interlocked that they immobilized the body. In fact, they were relatively light compared with some older croc lineages. That meant protection without sacrificing much in terms of flexibility or speed. Armor this moderate suggests a balance between defense and agility, which fits a predator that had to move actively on open ground instead of hiding underwater. Taken together, all these skeletal clues describe an animal that was mechanically capable of pursuit, with a reinforced shoulder, well-built torso, lighter armor, and likely strong hind limbs similar to its terrestrial cousins. Kostensuchus comes across less like the ambush hunters we know today and more like a pursuit predator. The sort of creature that could chase a dinosaur across open terrain rather than wait for it to drink at the water's edge. If you try to picture how that looked in motion, don't think lizard-like belly dragging. Think instead of a heavy-set mammal, one with broad shoulders and a stiff torso projecting forward, pounding across the ground with repeated strides. Maybe not lightning fast, but fast enough to run down a juvenile hadrosaur or a small plant eater that strayed too far from the herd. Now that a lifestyle can be inferred, what of the size of the beast? Let's bring in Mr. Man from Animal Planet's
the most extreme.
To show you what the researchers came up with, using math formulae and ratio comparisons between other terrestrial crocs plus modern crocs, the researchers found Costinsuchus to be about 3.5 meters long and 1/4 of a ton in weight. Being about 3.5 meters long puts Costinsuchus in a category with some of the largest modern crocodilians outside of full-grown Nile or saltwater crocs. Thanks, Mr. Man. Patagonia, at the end of the Cretaceous, hosted small to mid-sized herbivorous dinosaurs like Isasi, a swift biped, and vast herds of titanosaurs, whose juveniles no doubt strayed from the herd. Fossils from the Chorillo Formation indicate the presence of arthropods, crustaceans, insects, gastropods, bivalves, fish, amphibians, plesiosaurs, possible mosasaurs, rhynchocephalian reptiles, snakes, plenty of turtles, indeterminate hadrosaurs, and parankylosaurs, titanosaur eggshells, lithostrotian titanosaurs, plus the colossosaurian titanosaur Nullatitan, and of course, in antiornithine birds, the ornithoran bird, Kukne, and one of the largest megaraptors that we know of, Mape, some possible noasaur material, the long-snouted unelagiids, an antiornithine bird called Yatenavis, and a bunch of little mammals except for Patagomaya, which is a giant therian mammal. Well, giant for the time and place. A Costinsuchus of 3.5 meters and 1/4 of a ton would have been perfectly capable of overpowering prey in much of the size range of fossils found in the formation, except of course those titanosaurs. And a Costinsuchus could easily become prey to a giant adult Mape. Aside from Mape, Costinsuchus's teeth, built for cutting, jaws geared for locking, and a body mass high enough to pin struggling dinosaurs to the ground, made it abundantly clear that it sat high up on the food chain. It may not have rivaled the top carnivorous dinosaurs in outright size, but it would have put consistent predation pressure on smaller dinosaurs sharing the same landscapes. With so many weird croc cousins running around Gondwana, or many of these southern continents, how do you even figure out who's related to who? It's not like they left us tidy family albums. The tool paleontologists rely on is called phylogenetic analyses, which at its core is just a systematic way of testing relationships using traits. You can think of it as building a family tree, but instead of birthdays and surnames, a computer uses skull and skeleton features recorded in a dataset. The challenge is that many fossils are fragmentary, so if you want the resulting tree to be stable and trustworthy, the methods have to be tightly controlled. Otherwise, you get shifting branches every time a new piece is added, which doesn't actually tell you much about the animal's real place in evolution. For Costinsuchus, researchers ran their analysis using a large dataset that included about 120 different crocodiliform species, both living and extinct. They coded 444 separate traits across those animals. Traits here mean very specific things like the position of a hole in the skull, the orientation of a crest on a bone, or the shape of the teeth. By scoring Costinsuchus across as many of those traits as possible, the program could compare its anatomy with every other species already in the database. The output is a set of branching diagrams called cladograms, which highlight possible relationships. And since not every trait is equally informative, researchers rely on tests to make sure the broad patterns don't disappear the second you tweak the input. So, where did Costinsuchus end up in this grand croc family puzzle? The analysis consistently dropped it into the Pyrosauridae, a group of crocodiliforms known mostly from South America and Africa. Many members of this group don't share the widened snout shape and heavy skull ornamentation of Costinsuchus. That means we're probably looking at a branch of pyrosaurids that took land predation much further. The back end of Costinsuchus is missing, but the back ends of most other pyrosaurids were heavily armored, almost like pine cones of bone. Considering the more terrestrial adaptations of the rest of the skeleton of Costinsuchus, it would make sense that the back end would be less armored as well. What really added interest is that many of the hunting adaptations, the knife-like teeth, the reinforced jaws, the upright body plan, also appear in Baudousuchids, which are a completely separate clade from Brazil. This is a textbook example of convergent evolution. a term referring to unrelated groups independently developing similar traits because they're adapting to the same ecological pressures. Their last common ancestor didn't already carry those features. Instead, these traits appeared twice, arising in different lineages facing similar prey and habitats. That is powerful evidence that terrestrial apex predator niches in Gondwana were open enough for crocodiliforms to fill them multiple times, not just as aquatic ambushers. It underlines how plastic crocodile evolution really was. By nailing Kostensuchus onto this section of the puzzle, we learned that it wasn't a direct offshoot of Baurussukids, and it wasn't some odd outlier cousin of modern crocs either. It was a true pyrosaurid, but one that independently shifted into the hyper-carnivore lifestyle. That makes it not just one more addition to the fossil record, but a case study in how ecosystems encourage repeat solutions. A dinosaur-dominated Patagonia still found space for land crocs to rise into major predator roles. And once lifestyle and lineage were finally pieced together, the bigger question came back into focus. What does the appearance of a predator like this actually mean for our understanding of Cretaceous ecosystems? Here was a crocodiliform that stalked open ground, heavy-bodied and sharp-toothed, able to compete with dinosaurs for top predator space. Its wide snout and slicing teeth weren't adaptations for fish, they were weapons for cutting into flesh on land. That means late Cretaceous Patagonia wasn't just a dinosaur show, it was also home to crocs that filled apex roles. Every fossil like this reshapes our map of ancient life, and who knows, beneath the Patagonian wind, more of these prehistoric hunters might still be waiting.
For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.
Mm-hmm.